We're standing by, over.
Roger, Eagle, time dot.
Roger, how does it look?
The Eagle has wings. Looking good.
Roger, Neil, we got if you'll give us crew and data, we got the loads for you.
Right, Houston, Eagle is ready to copy.
Roger, Eagle, coming at you with a DOI pad. 101 36 1407. Down 81. Minus.
Gene Kran has just advised his flight controllers we're off to a good start. Play it cool. 12 minutes now until ignition for powered descent. Everything's still looking very good at this point. Roger, check was right on time.
Roger.
And Houston, we got a 500 alarm early in the program. Went to descent 1, proceeded on it, and we're back at auto again. Over.
Roger, we saw that buzz. Thank you much, Al.
I think, okay, that wasn't an alarm, that was a code, okay.
Roger, we saw that.
State scale 25.
Eagle, Houston, your alignment is go on Yags. On my mark, 330 till ignition.
Roger.
Roger, you're a go to continue power descent. You're a go to continue power descent.
30 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Big shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. Down a half.
30 seconds.
Forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Mode control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
July 21st, 1969, Tranquility Base. 20 years later, Washington. The same three heroes, Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins, face the press and reflect on how it was.
Apollo, to me, was a response to a challenge. It has been termed by many as one of the most audacious endeavors in human history to move outward. About a year ago, I elected to make an effort at putting down some of my reflections as to what I thought the significance was of putting together that event and the achieving of it, and it's available in the form of Men from Earth right now. I had hoped that along with that, this situation might be appropriate for this 20th anniversary to become a catalyst to chart a new course. Perhaps because I got caught up in the enthusiasm of the 60s and of achievement that we were all a part of, perhaps wishful thinking, I felt that this situation would be a very ripe one for the leadership of our nation to chart a course, a bold course for human expansion outward, becoming a bit more specific. I see that, and I'm doing some work with the Exploration Office, we're beginning to refine some of the choices. And certainly by the time that the anniversary of Columbus, 1992, comes around, I feel certainly we will have a course charted for human expansion outward. I think at this particular opportunity at the 20th anniversary, it would be very helpful if we could get some refining of just what the time span might be by our leadership, so that in the interim we could begin to more clearly focus some of the short-term objectives that we have toward the fulfillment of human expansion outward.
Bill Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times. How are you? For Neil Armstrong, in Houston on the 5th of July, I believe it was, of 1969, I asked you if you had thought of any memorable words to say as you landed on the moon. You said you had not. Then on the 20th, when you did land, you gave us some very memorable words indeed. I'm wondering when it came to you exactly what would be the appropriate thing to say.
Well, it was a statement that was natural in the sense of the time. It was a step, and thought about it really after we got there.
Frank Miles, Independent Television News, London. Since one of the main purposes of the Apollo program as a whole was to gather moon rock, and during the course of the 6 landings, 850 pounds, some 7.5 hundredweights was gathered, and I gather that in excess of 90% of that still lies untouched in a vault in Texas. Would you like to comment, Mr. Armstrong or
Yeah, I think
Dr.
that
Aldrin?
was a superb idea. It may be that we don't have the opportunity to return to the moon in the next decade or two. During that time period, new analytical techniques and experimental devices will be invented which will allow far more understanding of those samples than we have available to us with our current equipment and techniques. So the fact that we're saving large amounts of that rock for future use, I think, is perceptive and wise.
I'm Ida Molinari, Famiglia Cristiana, Italy. How did your great experience change your inner life?
Well, before 1969, the press conferences were much smaller.
Dick Uliano from AP Radio. For Mike Collins and Buzz Aldrin, it's estimated that it costs as much as $300 million to launch a space shuttle, and it could cost $30 billion to build the space station. That money could build a lot of houses here in the United States and feed a lot of hungry children. What would you say to Americans to justify the resources that go into space as opposed to being spent here at home?
I'd look at the numbers. We're putting less than 1% of our budget into the space program. I certainly think it's well worth that and more. We could carry out, I think, a very credible, expansive program for less than 2% of our budget. I don't really believe it's up to us to make value judgments as to exactly how that ought to be spent. I think we're expected to be firm advocates for a business that we were in for a good bit of our life, and I think we certainly are. We advocate expansion of space activities as much as possible.
I would just say that it's the responsibility of a government to take care of present needs and to anticipate future directions, and it seems to me that less than a penny on the federal dollar is not an excessive amount to look toward our future. We're a nation of explorers. If we had pursued the logic that says you have to take money from the space program and put it into restoring the cities, we would never have ventured beyond Jamestown or Plymouth, because certainly they were squalid little settlements with problems that dwarf the problems of cities today, and we never would have gotten west beyond the Appalachian Mountains had we decided to render those little colonies perfect before we continued our exploration, and I think that the same thing is true today.
Muriel Pearson, CBS News. This is a question for all of you. What was the moment of greatest personal fear for each of you during the flight, besides knowing that you'd have to face all of us when you got back?
Well, compared to that, all the rest sort of pale and insignificant.
I'll just answer that the thing you fear most is the unexpected. We used to spend a lot of time practicing our responses to various kinds of failures and abnormal circumstances, and I think we felt fairly comfortable with most of the kinds of things that might happen. The ones you worry about are the ones you didn't foresee and didn't properly prepare yourself for.
Well, I would say flying to the moon is a long and delicate daisy chain of events. Any link in the chain, if it gets severed, ruins the whole thing. The one that it wasn't fear, but was mistrust. The one that I mistrusted the most was the rendezvous part. That was the thing that was on my mind primarily, was bringing this ungainly-looking critter back up from the surface of the moon successfully.
John Getter, KHOU-TV. Gentlemen, I think what we're all struggling to try to explain here, maybe you can help us with, is an understanding of what was different then from what is now that allowed the whole world to get behind such a project for a short time. Is it simply that the Russians aren't as bad a guys as they used to be, that we have done this, that we don't have a dynamic president in the White House? Is it some combination? Is it just the times? What?
I think we all sense what you're trying to point at. Those years that were ripe for a commitment of that nature in the 60s were ones of international uncertainty and perhaps a bit of a questioning of where our technical competence was relative to some of the unknowns, what the Soviets were able to do then. A lot of that certainly has changed now, but I think we all sense that there's an exponential increasing of technology and capabilities to do things, and certainly space is a challenge to go out there, and just naturally we would like to expect responses to come to that challenge of the frontier, the cutting edge of technology demonstrations, to respond with a significant growing series of achievements. The capability technically does exist to do a lot of things, but also their price tag begins to go up rather significantly, and that tends to space them out a little. But once establishing an expectation of interesting, significant achievements of technology in space, I think we'd all just naturally like to see them continuing on in some fashion.
Well, the world in the 80s is a lot more complicated than the world of the 60s, at least in this country. President Kennedy said that we were going to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. That was his goal. President Bush, whom I consider to be a president as dynamic as Kennedy, I think in today's climate would have to say, I think we ought to dedicate ourselves to the goal of perhaps considering appointing a commission after due deliberation with the Congress of investigating the feasibility of certain long-range goals for the space program, perhaps even including a mission to Mars. It's just a sign of the times. The times are a lot more complicated today. Plus, there were a couple of precipitating events that caused Apollo to be launched that do not exist today.
Max Gomez from KYW-TV in Philadelphia. Let me try to put a slightly different spin on that same question and see if we have any better luck. You've all expressed some significant support for an expanded role of America in space exploration and a permanent place in space. The public, I think, the problem is they don't understand exactly why is it important that we continue to explore. And is that important for America? Is it important for perhaps mankind in general to continue to explore? And then just as importantly, because it's part of the argument that keeps going back and forth even within NASA, does man need to be a part of that exploration?
I think it's a good question and a fair question and probably the question. What is it about exploration? And I think it's just inherent in the human condition. I don't know whether we have an exploration gene or whether it's something that we acquire. I think we have a curiosity gene, and that's very, very close to exploration. But people have always gone where they've been able to go. Some tribes have been happy to stay in the rainforest, but if you go back to the littoral nations of Western Europe, they've always had an obsession to go out to the far corners of the globe, and it's just inherent in us. And I think particularly in this country, we're a nation of explorers. I mean, we've started on the East Coast, we went to the West Coast, and then vertically, I mean, starting with the Wright brothers, Yeager through the sound barrier, Armstrong and Aldrin on the moon. It's in our tradition, it's in our culture. It's a fundamental thing to want to go, to touch, to see, to smell, to learn. And that, I think, will continue in the future.
Washington, a press conference with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Mike Collins. And on the very day that the 20th anniversary falls, President Bush announces the next horizon.
Flanked by the astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins, Mr. Bush said the best way to honour the historic Apollo 11 crew would be to build the proposed American space station Freedom within the next 10 years. After that, Mr. Bush said Americans should return permanently to the moon and then explore Mars.
We must commit ourselves anew to a sustained program of manned exploration of the solar system, and yes, the permanent settlement of space. And our goal is nothing less than to establish the United States as the preeminent spacefaring nation.
The President did not announce a timetable or budget for his proposal, but he asked the Space Council to provide a detailed cost analysis to put before Congress. Martin DeBell, New York.
And this is Dr. Peter Pockley in Sydney.
A voice I hadn't heard for some time was on the phone yesterday. It's Brian O'Brien ringing from Perth to wish you a happy anniversary. Remember, we spent the night together 20 years ago. How could I forget? Ever since the liftoff, I'd been living and breathing with the astronauts, hooked up to them by an electronic umbilical. For the landing, we had a great team in the studio. Bob Leslie of the Australian Space Tracking Network knew the flight plan backwards. John Lane, an aviation medicine man, explained everything about heart rates, food and bowels. Earl Hackett kept us smiling with his marvellous wit. We had no plan of what to do if there'd been a disaster like a loss of oxygen, but I guess we'd have thrown it over to these two medicos to intone the last rites. When it came to the moonwalks, John Lovering gave us a running geological commentary. Brian O'Brien was a space scientist who knew all about the experiments placed on the surface of the moon. We had countless others contributing by landline and phone from distant parts. On Monday the 21st of July, we went continuously for some 13 hours, truly live to air, that is, without a time delay, and we didn't say anything rude or libelous to pollute the purity of the 60s. I think our values have changed a lot since those days. Mostly we accepted or marvelled at the technology which made the moon landing possible. We hardly questioned the value of the money spent on the space race. As our commentary team was built from the ABC Science Unit, we naturally looked for great things from the research projects flown on the Apollo missions, and we squeezed that topic as dry as the surface of that weird, lifeless landscape. So, when Dr. O'Brien called, I compared notes with him about the scientific results of the 6 Apollo missions to land on the moon. 20 years on, it seems our thoughts have progressed in similar directions. He said there were 3 main outcomes: psychological, technological, and scientific, in that order. Technological achievements there were aplenty, especially in rocket propulsion and the miniaturization and reliability of electronics. But we would probably have got there anyway, if somewhat slower. That's why I add a 4th major spin-off, the military capabilities of space. In fact, I give it top billing in the so-called civilian space program, an ominous, largely silent partner. As for science, it really ran a poor third. Only one of the 12 astronauts to walk on the moon was a scientist. That was Jack Schmitt, and he happened to be the only one I met. Among Earth scientists, Australia scored well. Ross Taylor, Bill Compston, Ted Ringwood and John Lovering were among the few selected by NASA to receive precious samples of moon rock for analysis. As a result, we now have an excellent notion of how the moon, the Earth and the solar system evolved some 4,500 million years ago. But what of this psychological achievement that Brian O'Brien spoke of? He was referring to the shock of recognition by all humankind that Earth is truly isolated in space and we'd better look after our little planet, or else. It certainly affected him. He had his dust detector flown on every Apollo mission. His charged particle detector, which measured how the moon is bathed in the plasma emitted by the sun, didn't reach the moon on the ill-fated Apollo 13 flight, but eventually got there on Apollo 14. Brian O'Brien was in the top league of space physicists. Yet, when he came back from supervising his experiments on these missions, he dropped the field to which he had devoted much of his life and converted to environmental science, which he practices to this day. So, after ignoring the military aspect and discounting all the jingoistic hype, perhaps the Apollo missions were worth it after all. But only perhaps. Where does it leave the manned space game now? President Bush wants the Americans to go back to the moon and then on to Mars. Given the perilous state of our own spaceship Earth, I think this would so distort our pressing priorities that I can only hope the US Congress votes it out.
Dr. Peter Pockley, who watched the landing from an ABC radio studio. Vince Ford, an astronomer at Mount Stromlo Observatory near Canberra, watched the event with his mates.
We just stopped for the afternoon, put a TV set up and sat there from lunchtime through to about 5 o'clock watching it all. I mean, that was probably the most exciting single event I've ever watched on TV. You know, it was great stuff. I'd like to have had a camera on the surface watching it come in, but that didn't happen till Apollo 16 or whenever it was.
The coverage was excellent because it was being beamed by an Australian receiver, wasn't it?
Australian, yeah. Parkes and Tidbinbilla.
So we brought the signal to the world?
Oh, absolutely, as we have with most deep space missions ever since. The Tidbinbilla setup was built primarily for Apollo. The satellites up to that stage hadn't needed a 210-foot dish to pick up the signals because they were all fairly close. But Tidbinbilla was built as a copy of Parkes, more or less, so you had two huge dishes in Australia. It had been the prime receivers ever since.
What was the comment around the television at Mount Stromlo when you were discussing the merits of the exercise, why people should go to the moon in the first place?
Well, I don't think anybody ever suggested that the prime aim of going to the moon was scientific. I mean, it was sort of political come, one up on the Russians type exercise if you go right back to tin tacks. Apart from that, it was probably the greatest exploration I think that man's taken to date. Probably from the time he hopped on a log and paddled across the rift to Australia. But while that was going on, there was dead silence in that tea room, and it's about the only time I've ever heard 40 astronomers be absolutely silent before or since. It was just real gripping stuff, particularly that last couple of minutes where they had to sort of shift the thing sideways a bit to set it down level.
Yes, I must admit my broadcasting career in radio began with the Apollo missions, and whatever you think of the merits, militaristic, scientific or otherwise, the actual event was absolutely thrilling. But what about the science? I mean, how much do you think Apollo really produced? Not just the first mission, but all of them.
Well, the 6 missions, I mean, there were only 6 that landed and did anything much before the program was cut to save money. I mean, we've been there, we've done that, what the hell. So out of those 6 missions, there was quite a lot of science done as a sort of sideline. The first thing that any of the astronauts did when they set foot on the moon was to grab a pocket full of rock. Just sort of whip whatever they could find handy, just in case something went wrong and they had to leave in a hurry. Now, for Apollo 11, which was the first one down, that was about the extent of the sampling. But afterwards they got quite carried away with the geological collecting, and they had special tongs to pick rocks up without having to bend down, dirty great cores. They brought back core samples from the lunar surface up to about 2.5 metres length. It was good geological sampling there towards the end. And overall, there's about 382 kilograms of moon rock stored away in Houston and small bits in various other places around the world that
anybody can work on. There's some in Canberra. I've actually held some moon in the Department of Earth Sciences at the ANU, your university. Ross Taylor and Ted Ringwood have some.
That's right.
Is it still there?
Still there. It sort of gets subjected to all sorts of tests from time to time, but it's kind of nice to have your own little chunk of moon sitting in the uni.
It's not green cheese, is it?
It's not green cheese, but by golly, it comes close. I mean, if you think of cheese as being something that's mulched up and packed in together, that's a pretty good description of the rocks on the moon. It's been pounded by meteorites for so long that most of the actual rocks have been shattered and packed in together by pressure again. In fact, up in the lunar highlands, where the oldest rocks are found, those rocks have been shattered and packed together up to about 3 or 4 times over their history. And in fact, the whole surface in the highlands is shattered down to about 25 kilometres depth just from this constant ongoing meteoric bombardment. So I guess, yeah, in that sense it could be cheese, but it's not green.
What's it made of, actually?
It's pretty much like rock on Earth, Robyn. The same sort of chemicals are in it, particularly in the mare, those sort of broad, flat, volcanic lava flow areas that make up the man in the moon sort of thing. That is very much like earthly basalt. But the only difference with moon rock is it's never had much water, and of course there's no atmospheric oxygen to oxidise it. So chemically the rocks are far simpler than the rocks you find on Earth at the moment, because of course the Earth's had quite a solid atmosphere and turbulent geological history. Other thing about the moon in general is it hasn't changed much for the last 3.9 billion years. When the main meteoric bombardment finished, when the lunar volcanism died out, nothing much has changed since then. So it's a good sample of what things were like about 3.9 billion years ago in some ways.
Yes, it makes you think then of where the moon came from, and I just wonder whether the rock that was brought back gives us any clue. I mentioned Ted Ringwood before. He published an extraordinary article in the journal Nature about the possible origin of the moon. Ted Ringwood from the Australian National University. Right. What's the general consensus on the origin of the moon at the moment?
Well, about 20, 30 years back, Harold Urey said any explanation of the moon is thoroughly implausible, and we haven't really got very far from there. I mean, we know an awful lot about the history of the moon from the time it got there, but how it actually got there is still a bit of an open question, I think. One thing for sure, I don't think it's the bit that was ripped out of the hole that the Pacific Ocean filled up like my science teacher used to tell me back in year 3, but just about every one of the main theories of how the moon could have got there have got problems. The best bet at the moment is the theory that Stuart Ross Taylor and Professor Ringwood and co-workers are pushing at the moment, which involves an actual collision between the Earth in its semi-molten state and a fairly large asteroid, a thing about the size of Mercury or thereabouts, which actually hit the Earth not quite square on and blew a great chunk of the outside crust away. They need to invoke this sort of arrangement because the moon rock is very similar to Earth rock, but not quite the same. It hasn't got as much of the heavy metals in it. It's more like the rock you find in the crust of the Earth than the stuff deeper in towards the centre. So you need to get lighter rock. And one way of doing this is just to have this sort of off-centre collision that peels a fairly sizable chunk of the Earth's crust off very early on in the Earth's history and have that bit coalesce to form the moon. I think that's probably as good runner for how the moon got there at this stage of the game.
So the astronauts may have, in fact, been walking around in what used to be their own backyard.
Dead right.
Amazing thought. And their debris, their footprints, their apparatus, there's still quite a considerable amount of it left there, isn't there?
That's right. As well as collecting rocks, of course, every Apollo flight from the second one on left experiments behind, the so-called ASELPs, the Apollo Spacecraft Lunar Experiment Package. They're little packages with their own little nuclear generator in them, which measured things like solar wind, the heat flow, the seismology. They all had little seismographs in them to measure moonquakes and so on. And they sat there working. They're still in working condition, but they were turned off in 1978 to save funds, which is a bit sad because it must cost very little to keep them going. Probably about the US's armament bill for 3 minutes sort of thing. I kind of get quite irate at things like that. I mean, we've got experiment packages on the moon, we've got experiment packages on Mars in working condition that are being turned off to save money, but there doesn't seem to be all that much trouble sort of getting money for a Star Wars system or something. I think that's a pretty bad way to run your economy or, you know, run your civilization.
Or $1 billion for a stealth bomber, indeed. But we went to the moon 20 years ago. We stopped going, as you said.
The last one was 1972 in December. We just stopped. I mean, for 4 years there, between 69 and 72. Well, you know, we had the makings of being an interstellar civilization or an interplanetary civilization. We'd made the first step, and the moon is really the first step in going further out, I think. We just stopped. Nobody's shown any sign of going anywhere off the face of the Earth since. And in fact, if we set out to go to the moon today, we couldn't do it. Because all the systems that were set up, the life support systems, the rocketry, have just been scrapped. So if we set out to go to the moon today, it would take probably another 4 or 5 years of effort just to get the hardware together to do it.
It's an incredible thought, isn't it, that even those 20 years ago, which we regard as like ancient history, before many of the sophisticated things we take for granted today, I mean, before CDs, before compact discs, before
digital wristwatches. Well, all these things, of course, were spin-offs from the space program and Apollo. It's not just the rocket brought back, it's the technology that went into it, produced things that people use today without ever thinking of the space program. The great boost it gave to computers, digital electronics. One of those things that you get as a sideline of going in for the long shots, the exploration, the bits that don't have any immediate obvious return.
Should we go to the moon again, do you think?
Well, as an astronomer, I think the moon is the place to be. I mean, we're having trouble, as far as astronomy is concerned, just with light pollution on the Earth, with the fact that there are a lot of satellites up there that are now starting to signal back things like what's happening in the middle of Moscow sort of thing, at wavelengths that interfere with our radio astronomy. For an astronomer, the best place to be is on the far side of the moon, where you're shielded from the Earth. and you can work a lot better there. But I think apart from that, we've got to get off this earth eventually. We've got limited resources here. And if we are to survive as a race, even with the best conservation techniques we can dream up, we're going to run out sometime. The only source of new materials and so on we've got is out in space. We have to make that move sometime, and the moon really is the stepping stone. I think we've got to go back there sometime and keep going this time.
You'd go, would you?
Oh, give me a chance. I'll be there like a shot.
Vince Ford at Mount Stromlo Observatory, part of the Australian National University. But what does the anniversary look like from Moscow, where the Soviet Union seems at first to be well ahead of the Americans? John Lombard reports.
Last December, 2 Soviet cosmonauts broke the world space endurance record. Commander Vladimir Titov and his co-pilot Musa Manarov stayed aloft for 366 days, breaking the previous record by 40 days. The two were national heroes and given star treatment. But then suddenly in April, the new crew of the Mir space station were recalled to Earth, and the craft was left unmanned for the first time since its launch in February 3 years ago. Just a month earlier, the Soviet space program suffered a humiliating experience when its Phobos 2 spaceship failed to make its planned rendezvous with Mars. Then there was a decision to ground the reusable Buran shuttle, which had been idle since its maiden flight last November. Now the Soviet program is fighting to survive. The fact is that the Soviet peoples want Mars bars, not Mars probes. The demand for consumer goods and just basic foodstuffs is so great that Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev has had to think again about his space targets. The paradox of a country that can lead the world in space technology but can't feed itself has made the Kremlin change course. It's been revealed that spending on the Soviet space program since 1986 has amounted to 1.47 billion rubles. That's about 2.35 billion US dollars at the arbitrary exchange rate. Most of the money has been spent on the Mir orbital space station. During the campaign for the March Soviet election, there was a lot of criticism from candidates querying the leadership's priorities. The Communist Party daily newspaper Pravda called for a reassessment, and a senior space official told the government newspaper Izvestia that equipment on board the Mir station wasn't working properly, and that crews were spending most of their time on repairs, which is a very Soviet way of life. Soviet space officials have agreed that there is a need to justify their expenditure, but argue that the space program as a whole is vital for the country's scientific development. Boris Salimov, a cosmonaut of the 1970s, said that the discussions were like building a hotel and then deciding whether or not you needed a doorman. There might be room for negotiating on certain programs, he said, and to use funds in a more rational way, but you can't put everything into the melting pot. One reaction has been to put the space program onto a self-financing basis, like almost everything else is now in the Soviet Union. Selling services on the Soviet program for hard currency is now in full swing. Satellite photographs and other data can now be bought for hard cash, although it's said the returns are not good. Of greater potential is the sale of flights to the Mir station, and even advertising space on board the spacecraft. The going rate for a 2-week trip to Mir is 10 million US dollars. But even that sometimes causes problems at home. When a Japanese television company booked a flight for one of its journalists, there was an uproar in the Soviet media that a foreign hack should even be considered ahead of one of the comrades. The Soviets are also offering space on board their satellites or even entire spacecraft to the West. One lucrative market being explored is in microgravity research. This involves experiments into the production of materials in the near weightlessness of a low Earth orbit. One West German company is reported to have booked several flights. And finally, there is a market for launching satellites for foreigners. With more than 100 Soviet launches a year and a wide range of launch vehicles, there's plenty of capacity. The only problem here is that Washington won't allow satellites either built in the United States or with American content to be launched by the Soviets because of a fear that they'll pinch the American technology. President Gorbachev is keen to use the new spirit of better East-West relations to get international cooperation in space. Cooperation that could mean the end of the space race. John Lombard, Moscow.
And we end, as we must, with a poem. The one written at the time, 20 years ago, by Dr. Earl Hackett.
When the moon becomes our #1 satellite, it'll be a serious business for writers of verses. There's only one rhyme for satellite, and that's patellite, which means someone interested in the welfare of kneecaps. I met him on our satellite. Oh, list ye while I tell. He said, I am a patellite, and kneecaps I do sell. Not very good, really, is it? Of course, there'll still be the sun, but the rhymes for sun are surprisingly few, and very dull, like overdone, and run, and stun, and such like. But for real good rhymes, give me moon. Oon is such a lovely syllable. To demonstrate which, I'll now rhyme it 34 times. Oh, let me give tune to a loving lampoon, for, darling, 'tis soon we shall walk on the moon, before it is strewn by a Yankee platoon, with flag and maroon, and drum and bassoon, and beer and spittoon, and TV and cartoon. Come, let me dragoon you to eat macaroon in a lunar saloon, by a dusty lagoon on a warm afternoon, with no fear of typhoon, or simoon, or monsoon, or raccoon, or baboon, or buffoon, or poltroon, or a Marshall McLuhan to upset our pontoon. I will deck and festoon you with hat and